դեռ ապացուցված չի։ Ու կարող է չապացուցվի։ Կարող է երրորդ մարդը։
Դու նորից ես ինքնասպանություն անելու, բայց այս անգամ փորձ չլինելու, այս անգամ
Զարմանալի բան չկա, մենք ուղղակի իրար հետ կապ ենք պահում։
Վերջին հաշվով ես այս կյանքում ամեն ինչ կորցրել եմ։ Էլ ոչ։
Որին գտնեմ։ Այդքան էլ ուզում եմ նվերին սպանել։
Ինձ օգնել է ազդել է ինչ-որ կերպ ձեր հարաբերությունների վրա։
Սեդա դու ընդհանրապես
Որ շատերը ինձ են մեղադրում ու մտածում են, որ ես ավելի մեղավոր եմ։ Հիմա ուզում եմ
ինչ ես անում։
Mina sat alone in the dim living room long after midnight, phone in hand, staring at a missed call from a number he did not recognize. And when Susie came in, wrapped in her shawl, and asked why he had been sitting like that for an hour, he told her he was thinking. And when she pressed him about the girl, about Monet, he snapped at her not to say that name in his house. And Susie said she was not trying to upset him, only to understand him, since he had driven off with a stranger and left her standing in the yard like a fool, and now refused to explain anything. And Minas admitted that Monet had said things that did not make sense yet, but that if even half of them were true, then everything he thought he understood about what happened to his sister was wrong. And when Susie asked what exactly Monet had said, he told her that Monet believed Nvere had ruined her life, that Nvere had used her, that the whole business with Harut and the fire at the old building might be connected. And Susie asked, connected how? And Mina said he did not know yet, that not knowing was what was killing him, that every time he thought he understood what had happened to his sister, something new came out from underneath it, and it was always worse. And he grabbed his jacket, and Susie asked where he was going at almost midnight, and he said he was going to find Monet before she disappeared the way everyone else in this story kept disappearing. And he walked out, leaving Susie alone with her cold tea, sitting down slowly and holding her stomach as though she might be sick. Meanwhile, across the city, Harut walked briskly along a quiet residential street with his hands in his pockets and his breath visible in the cold air. And his phone buzzed, and it was Gor, asking where he had been for 20 minutes. And Harut said he was walking, that he needed air. And Gor asked, air or running from something? And Harut said maybe both. And Gor told him that the investigator had called his cousin's friend at the station, and that they had found something in the burned building, ash samples, some kind of residue, that it might not have been an accident. And Harut stopped walking, and said that meant someone had set it on fire deliberately. And Gor said that was what it sounded like. And Harut said quietly that then Seta had been right all along, that someone had followed them, that someone had known exactly where that place was, and burned it before anyone could find proof. And Gor warned him to be careful, that whoever was capable of burning down a building to erase evidence might be capable of worse, to erase people. And Harut said he had to see her, meaning Seta. And Gor asked if he understood it was midnight and her family already thought he was circling her like a vulture. And Harut said he did not care anymore what they thought, that he cared about her safety, that if someone was willing to burn evidence, they might come back to make sure she never remembered anything else. And after a pause, Gor offered to come with him, and Harut refused, saying that if something happened, he didn't want Gor caught up in it too. And he hung up before Gor could argue, and kept walking faster toward the Vardanian house. Inside that house, in her room, Seta sat on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at an old photograph of herself and Ellen laughing at some forgotten party, her face pale and tired. And there was a soft knock, and Ellen came in, looking nervous, glancing back down the hallway before she spoke, saying she could not sleep, that she kept thinking of Seta alone in that room. And Seta said she was not alone, she had her thoughts, and they were loud enough for company. And Ellen sat at the edge of the bed and said she needed to tell her something, and needed her not to hate her for it. And Seta sat up straighter and asked what it was. And Ellen confessed that Nvere had been asking her things about Seta, about what she remembered, calling constantly, cornering her at the cafe. And Seta asked what kind of questions. And Nvere said Nvere wanted to know whether Seta had said anything about that night, whether she had mentioned any names, that Nvere seemed desperate to know if Seta remembered who had been there. And Seta asked what Ellen had told her. And Ellen swore she had told her nothing real, but that the way Nvere asked was not curiosity, it was fear, that she was afraid of what Seta might remember. And Seta's eyes narrowed as she said that Nvere would only be afraid of what she might remember if Nvere already knew something she should not. And Ellen admitted she kept asking herself the same thing, that she hated herself for letting Nvere use her like this, that she should have said something sooner but had been scared, that Nvere had made it sound like protecting Minas's reputation, like it was for the family, but that she no longer believed that was the real reason. And Seta stood and paced slowly despite the lingering pain in her body, and told Ellen that if Nvere knew something about that night, they needed to find out what before she convinced everyone else that Seta was the unstable one, the unreliable witness. And she told Ellen to keep talking to Nvere, to let her think she was still on her side, but to report back every word exactly, because if Nvere was hiding something, she would slip eventually. And Ellen asked what would happen if Minas found out she had been talking to Nvere behind his back all this time, and Seta said she would tell him herself, that Ellen had done it to protect her, that he would understand, that he had to. At that moment, there was a soft tap at the window that startled them both, and Ellen froze while Seta moved cautiously to the curtain and saw Harut standing below in the garden, gesturing for her to come down, and she felt a rush of relief seeing him, grabbed a shawl, and told Ellen she did not care what Minas thought if he found out, that something was clearly wrong given the look on Harut's face. And she slipped out through a side door into the cold garden where Harut stood tense and urgent, and she asked what he was doing there at this hour, saying if Minas saw him again, and Harut said he wouldn't have come if it were not important. And she asked what had happened, and he told her about the building, the one where she had started remembering things, that the police had found evidence it had been burned on purpose, that someone had set the fire deliberately, and said his breath caught as she said, so it hadn't been a coincidence. And Harut said no, that someone had followed them there or already knew they would go back, someone who wanted no trace of that night to survive. And he said he had needed to warn her tonight and not tomorrow, that she needed to be more careful than she had been, because if they were willing to destroy a building, he didn't know what else they were willing to do. And Seta wrapped her arms around herself and told him that whoever had done this to her was still out there watching, always one step ahead of everyone trying to find them. And she told him that Ellen had just revealed that Nvere had been obsessively questioning her about what Seta remembered, terrified of what might come out. And Harut's jaw tightened as he said Nvere's name like an accusation, and Seta asked if he thought it was her, and he said he didn't know, but that everything kept circling back to her. The jealousy toward Minas, the manipulation of Ellen, even the woman named Mene who had shown up screaming at the family's gate claiming Nvere had ruined her life too. And Seta wondered aloud whether Nvere had used Mene to destroy Harut's name so that no one would believe anything he said about that night. And Harut said bitterly that it would explain a great deal. Mene had tearing out of nowhere, accusing him of things that never happened, the same night the fire happened at that building. And Seta said they needed to find Mene and talk to her directly, without Minas controlling everything. And Harut warned that her brother would never allow it. And Seta said her brother didn't have to know everything she did anymore. And Harut studied her face, the fear beneath her determination, and asked her directly whether she remembered anything else, even something small, a voice, a smell, a shape in the dark, anything that might tell them who had really been there. And Seta closed her eyes and concentrated, her hand going to her temple, and said there was a voice, low, almost gentle, telling her not to be afraid, but that every time she tried to hold on to it, it slipped away like water. And Harut asked if it was a man's voice or a woman's, and she admitted she didn't know, that maybe it had been both, that maybe there had been more than one person there. And they stood in silence, letting that possibility settle over them. And Harut said that this was not just about one person protecting themselves, that it could be a group working together. And Seta shivered and said that meant it could be someone even closer to her than she wanted to believe. And Harut stepped closer, instinctively reaching for her hands to steady her, and told her that whatever happened, whoever it turned out to be, he was not leaving this unfinished, that he owed her that much for everything she had endured. And she said softly that he didn't owe her anything, that he had already given her more than anyone else in that house had. And a long, unspoken look passed between them, fragile and dangerous given everything around them, until a light flicked on in an upstairs window, and they both froze and stepped apart. And Harut whispered that someone was awake, and Seta urged him to go before anyone saw him, and he told her to be careful, that he meant it, and disappeared into the shadows of the garden while she watched him go, and then turned back to the house with new resolve on her face. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit apartment across the city, Nvere sat at a table with an untouched glass of wine, staring at her phone, and the screen showed a text from an unknown contact reading that Seta was starting to remember more than they thought, and that she needed to handle it. And she deleted the message immediately with trembling hands, just as a knock at the door made her jump. And she composed herself before opening it to find Mene standing there, his face hard and unreadable, and he pushed past her into the apartment saying he needed to ask her something, and needed the truth and not another performance. And Nvere, masking her surprise, asked what performance he meant. And Mene said he meant Mene, the woman who had come to their house screaming that Nvere had ruined her life, that Nvere had used her to destroy Harut's name. And Nvere's expression flickered with a half-second of panic before she recovered, and claimed she had never spoken to that woman in her life. And Mene stepped closer, demanding she explain why Mene knew details about Harut's relationship that only someone close to the situation would know, why she had shown up the same night the building where Seta had been assaulted burned to the ground. And Nvere's voice rose as she accused him of believing the ramblings of a hysterical stranger over her, and Mene said he was asking her to look him in the eyes and tell him she had nothing to do with any of it. Could she do that? And there was a long pause before her composure cracked slightly, and she said quietly that she had never wanted anything except for him to see her the way he used to, that she had never wanted anything except to stop feeling invisible next to his sister's tragedy. And Mene said that was not an answer, and her voice broke as she asked, "What do you want me to say? That she was capable of destroying an innocent woman's life out of jealousy? Was that who he thought she was?" And he said quietly, with deadly seriousness, that he didn't know who she was anymore, and that was the problem. And he turned to leave, and she grabbed his arm, begging him to wait, saying that whatever he thought of her, whatever Mene had said, she would never hurt Seta, that she might not love her the way he did, that she might resent the attention Seta's tragedy consumed, but she was not a monster, and he pulled his arm free and told her to prove it, to find out everything she could about who this Mene really was, and why she was suddenly so interested in destroying Harut's name, that if she was innocent, it should not be hard for her, and he left without waiting for a response. And Nvera stood alone, staring at the closed door with shaking hands, before picking up her phone again and dialing a number, whispering urgently into it that they needed to talk now, that things were getting out of control. The next day, in a small, dimly lit apartment across the city, Nvera sat at a table with an untouched glass of wine, staring at her phone, and the screen showed a text from an unknown contact reading that Seta was starting to remember more than they thought, and that she needed to handle it. And she deleted the message immediately with trembling hands, just as a knock at the door made her jump, and she composed herself before opening it to find Mene standing there, his face hard and unreadable, and he pushed past her into the apartment, saying he needed to ask her something, and needed the truth and not another performance. And Nvera, masking her surprise, asked what performance he meant. And Mene said he meant Mene, the woman who had come to their house screaming that Nvera had ruined her life, that Nvera had used her to destroy Harut's name. And Nvera's expression flickered with a half-second of panic before she recovered, and claimed she had never spoken to that woman in her life. And Mene stepped closer, demanding she explain why Mene knew details about Harut's relationship that only someone close to the situation would know, why she had shown up the same night the building where Seta had been assaulted burned to the ground. And Nvera's voice rose as she accused him of believing the ramblings of a hysterical stranger over her, and Mene said he was asking her to look him in the eyes and tell him she had nothing to do with any of it. Could she do that? And there was a long pause before her composure cracked slightly, and she said quietly that she had never wanted anything except for him to see her the way he used to.
That she had told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, but now, with everything happening, she could not pretend anymore. And Minas cut her off, saying this was not the time, and Susie said it was never the time with him, that there was always some crisis, some emergency, some reason to postpone dealing with them, but that she was his wife and deserved honesty even if it was ugly. And Minas rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed, and said quietly that he did not know what he felt anymore, that between Seta's case, the business, the campaign, and now this mess with Nivere, he felt like he was drowning, and every direction he turned, someone needed something from him that he did not know how to give. And Susie softened slightly and told him to let her help, to stop shutting her out like she was another problem to manage instead of his partner. And he looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, not quite warmth, but acknowledgement. And he said he would try, that he promised he would try. And their daughter Ava ran into the kitchen asking if they could go to the park, and Susie knelt to her level with a forced smile, saying, "Not today, sweetheart. Papa has a lot of work." And Ava pouted, saying they always said that. And Minas crouched down too, and promised that once everything settled down, they would go somewhere special, just the three of them. And Ava brightened slightly, though still disappointed, and ran off. And Minas and Susie shared a fragile, uncertain, but small truce of a look. Meanwhile, upstairs in Seta's room, she sat at her vanity tracing the fading bruises on her arm with her fingers, when Ellen burst in out of breath, saying she had just gotten a call from a friend at the police station, that Mane had gone in that morning and given a statement. And Seta turned quickly, asking about what? And Ellen said, about Nivere, that Mane had said Nivere used her, paid people to handle problems, that they thought Nivere might be connected to the fire, to covering up what had happened to Seta. And Seta stood abruptly, her face a mixture of shock and vindication, saying she had known it, that she had known something was wrong with the way Nivere kept pushing Ellen for information. And Ellen said the police wanted to bring Nivere in for questioning, that if this was true, if Nivere really had orchestrated all of this. And Seta interrupted urgently, saying the Nivere knew exactly who had assaulted her, that she might have hired them herself or covered for someone who had. And Ellen said if that was true, this was not just about jealousy anymore, this was something much darker. And Seta sat back down heavily, processing this with her hand trembling, saying that all this time she had thought the danger was some stranger on a dark road, but it had been someone inside their own circle the entire time. And Ellen asked what they should do now, and Seta steeled herself, saying they would wait for the police to bring Nivere in, and when they did, she wanted to be there. She wanted to look her in the eyes when the truth finally came out. Across the city, near the taxi stand, Harut leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching the street when Gor approached with 2 cups of coffee, handing one over and noting that Harut looked like he had not slept in days. And Harut admitted he had not, that every time he closed his eyes he thought about the fire, about someone out there still capable of hurting Seta. And Gor said word traveled fast in the city, that they were saying Mane had gone to the police and given a statement, implicating Nivere in some kind of scheme. And Harut looked up sharply, asking, implicating her how? And Gor said paying people to cover things up, maybe even connected to the fire at that building.
And Harut set the coffee down, running a hand through his hair, saying that if that were true, then everything made sense. The jealousy, the manipulation of Ellen, even Manet's sudden appearance accusing him of things that never happened, that it had all been part of covering something much bigger. And Gor asked if he thought Nivere had been involved in what happened to Seta directly, or just covering for whoever did it. And Harut said he did not know, but that either way she had been playing everyone, Mina, Susie, Ellen, even Manet, like pieces on a board. And Gor said seriously that if the police brought her in, this could finally clear Harut's name completely. No more suspicion, no more looking over his shoulder. And Harut said quietly that he did not care about clearing his name anymore, not really. That he cared about making sure whoever had done this to Seta never got the chance to hurt her again. And Gor studied his friend for a long moment, and said he had fallen for her, truly fallen for her. And Harut did not deny it, saying she deserved someone who saw her as more than a scandal, more than a story people whispered about, someone who just saw her. And Gor asked if he thought that was him, a taxi driver, and the sister of a man who wanted to be a member of parliament. And Harut said bitterly that he knew how it looked. He knew what people would say, but none of that changed what he felt. And then his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, saying, "Meet me, alone. I know who really did this to Seta." And Harut's face hardened, and Gor asked what it was, and Harut showed him the phone, saying someone claimed to know the truth and wanted to meet him alone. And Gor warned this could be a trap, especially with everything happening with the fire in Nivere. And Harut, already walking toward his car, said maybe, but that if there was even a chance this led them to who had really hurt her, he had to take it. And Gor followed urgently, insisting he was coming too, no arguments this time. And Harut hesitated, then nodded once, and they both got into the taxi. Back at the police station, in the interrogation room, neither sat across from investigator Bagdasarian, her posture rigid and defensive, a tape recorder between them. And Bagdasarian told her they had a statement from a woman named Manet, alleging that Nivere had paid her to make false accusations against Harut and Seta in order to distract from the investigation into Seta's assault. And Nivere said coldly that the woman was clearly troubled, that she had never given her money for anything. And Bagdasarian said they also had preliminary evidence suggesting the building where the assault took place had been deliberately burned to destroy forensic evidence, professionally done, according to the technicians, and asked if she had any explanation for that. And Nivere's voice tightened as she said she did not know anything about any fire, that she was being framed clearly by someone who wanted to see her destroyed. And Bagdasarian leaned forward, asking who would want to destroy her, and her eyes darted briefly, betraying her composure, as she said she did not know. Maybe someone jealous of her relationship with Minas, maybe someone who had wanted to see her fail from the beginning. And Bagdasarian said calmly and relentlessly that they could trace financial transactions, that if money had moved from her accounts to anyone connected to Manet or to anyone who could have set that fire, they would find it, that it would be far better for her to tell the truth now before they uncovered it themselves. And Nivere's hands clenched in her lap, and for a moment her mask slipped entirely, revealing fear, desperation, something close to grief. And her voice cracked as she said she had never wanted anyone to get hurt, that she just wanted to stop feeling invisible, that she wanted Minas to see her the way he used to, before Seta's tragedy consumed every conversation, every thought, every moment of his life. And Bagdasarian said, so she admitted to manipulating Manet, and she said yes quietly, defeated, that she had convinced Manet to accuse Seta, to make it look like jealousy between two women over Harut, that she had thought if enough confusion surrounded the case, no one would look too closely at certain details. And Bagdasarian asked what details, and Nivere hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, and said she knew who had really been there that night, that she had known for a while, but that if she told him everything she had built, everyone she loved, all of it would be destroyed. And Bagdasarian said firmly that obstructing a criminal investigation, especially one involving assault and arson, carried severe consequences, that whatever she was protecting, it was time to let it go. And there was a long, heavy silence before Nvir, staring at the table, visibly breaking apart, whispered that it was, barely audible. And just as she seemed about to name the person, the door burst open, and an officer entered urgently, saying they needed Bagdasarian outside immediately, that there had been an incident. And Bagdasarian stood torn between the breakthrough moment and the urgency in the officer's voice, telling Vir this conversation was not over before he hurried out, leaving her alone at the table shaking, the truth still trapped behind her lips. Meanwhile, at an isolated row of dilapidated warehouses, Harut's taxi pulled up, and Gor, scanning the area tensely, said the place gave him a bad feeling. And Harut, checking his phone, said the message had told him to come alone, but that he had brought Gor anyway. And Gor said that was smart, that if this was some kind of trap, at least there were two of them. And they exited the car cautiously as a nervous man in his 30s emerged from the shadow of one of the warehouses, glancing around constantly as if worried about being watched. And he said quietly and urgently that they had come, good, that they did not have much time. And Harut asked who he was and what he knew about Seta, and the man said his name did not matter, that what mattered was that he had been hired to torch that building, the one where the police had found Ash. And Harut's expression darkened as he asked, hired by whom? And the man, glancing around nervously, said he did not know her real relationship to the family, only that she had paid well and made it very clear the job needed to be done quietly, quickly, and without questions. And Gor asked if it was Nvere, and the man hesitated before saying he had been told to deal with a woman matching that description, yes, but that she was not the only one involved, that there had been someone else giving orders too, someone he had never seen directly, only heard through phone calls she made in front of him. And Harut urgently asked, who? What had he heard? And the man said a name, just once, slipped out during an argument on the phone, that she had said, if Minas ever finds out what you did to his sister. And then the man stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in fear as he looked past Harut and Gor toward the road, saying panicked that someone was coming and he had to go. And Harut shouted for him to wait to finish the sentence, but the man was already running, disappearing between the warehouses before Harut could stop him. And a car engine roared in the distance, headlights cutting through the dust. And Gor, alarmed, said they needed to move now. And they scrambled back into the taxi just as an unfamiliar dark sedan sped past the warehouse entrance, slowing briefly as if searching before continuing on. And Harut and Gor sat frozen in the taxi, hearts pounding. And Harut, breathing hard, said, did Gor hear that? If Minas ever finds out what you did to his sister. That meant whoever had attacked Seta was someone close enough that Minas discovering the truth would destroy them completely. And Gor said that could be almost anyone in that family circle. And Harut said grimly, not anyone. Someone with something to lose if Minas ever found out. Someone protected by proximity, by trust. And he started the car with his hands shaking slightly on the wheel. And Gor asked where they were going. And Harut said back to the Vardanian house, that Seta needed to know what they had just heard before whoever was behind this decided to silence the wrong person permanently. Back at the house, in her room in the late afternoon, Seta paced anxiously with her phone in hand while Ellen sat nearby, equally tense. And Ellen asked if there was any word from the police station, and Seta said nothing yet, that if Mane's statement was being taken seriously, Nvere should be there right now, answering for everything. And suddenly there was a commotion downstairs, raised voices, a door slamming, and both women froze listening. And Ellen asked what that was, and Seta, moving toward the door, said she did not know and told Ellen to stay. And she opened the door cautiously and moved down the hallway toward the staircase, where below, in the main hall, Minas stood with investigator Bagdasaryan, both men grim-faced. And Seta called down asking Minas what was happening, and he looked up, his face pale, and told her to come down, that there was something she needed to hear. And she descended slowly, gripping the railing, with Ellen following close behind. And Seta asked if it was about Nvere, and Bagdasaryan nodded gravely, saying they had brought her in for questioning that morning, and that she had admitted to manipulating a woman named Mane into making false accusations against Seta and Harut. And Seta breathlessly, so it was true, that she had been trying to protect someone, and Bagdasaryan said she had been about to give them a name when they were interrupted by another development. And Minas asked tightly, what development? And Bagdasaryan, hesitating, choosing his words carefully, said there had been an incident, that Nvere had been being transferred for further questioning when the vehicle was involved in a collision, that she was currently in critical condition at the hospital. And Seta's hand flew to her mouth while Ellen gasped behind her, and Minas, stunned, asked how, when? And Bagdasaryan said they were investigating whether it had truly been an accident, or whether someone had wanted to make sure she never finished that sentence. And at that moment the front door burst open and Harut questioned, breathless with Gor close behind, stopping short as he saw the investigator and the tension in the room. And he said urgently that he needed to talk to Seta, that he had information. And then he stopped, noticing everyone's stricken expressions, and asked what had happened. And Seta, her voice shaking, said Nvere had been in an accident, that she might not survive. And Harut's face shifted from confusion to alarm as he asked if she had been about to say who was really responsible. And Bagdasaryan sharply asked how he knew that. And Harut said because he had just come from a meeting with a man who had confessed to being hired to burn that building, that the man had said someone had given orders through a woman matching Veer's description, but that there had been someone else behind her, someone he had only heard mentioned once on a phone call, someone connected closely enough to Minas that the truth coming out would destroy them. And the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Minas looked around at everyone present, Seta, Ellen, Susie, who had just entered from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion, Harut, his expression a mixture of dawning horror and disbelief, and he said quietly, almost to himself, someone close enough that, and he could not finish the sentence, his eyes moving slowly across every face in that room, lingering just a fraction too long on each of them in turn, on Susie, standing frozen by the doorway with her hands pressed to her chest, on Ellen, whose eyes would not meet his, on the investigator who was watching him with the careful patience of a man waiting to see who would break first, and on Seta herself, pale and trembling but resolute, and the silence stretched on, heavy with everything unsaid, everything half-remembered, every fragment of memory and every buried motive circling closer and closer to a single name that none of them had yet dared to speak aloud, while outside the first drops of rain began to fall against the windows of the house, as if the sky itself were holding its breath along with everyone inside.